Aaliya Khan, a young woman in Chicago, is forced into an arranged marriage with Imran Qureshi but bravely resists. After suffering abuse, she exposes Imran's fraud and the corruption of community elders during her wedding, sparking public outrage. This act makes her a symbol of resistance, leading her to found the Ashes House, a shelter for women escaping forced marriages and abuse. Her courage brings down Imran, weakens the elders' power, and inspires other women to fight for their rights. Before I dive into this story, drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about finding strength when you need it most. The hall smelled of cardamom tea and incense, but beneath that sweetness lurked something rotten. Aaliya Khan stood at the center of the gathering, draped in a crimson scarf pinned too tightly around her head. The women bustled around her like bees, their voices buzzing with judgment disguised as affection. "Smile wider," snapped Auntie Roxana, her bangles clinking like chains. "A bride must look happy, no matter what's in her heart." Aaliya obeyed, though her lips quivered from the strain. She was 23, born and raised in Chicago to an immigrant family that worshipped appearances as zealously as they feared shame. Her father was already gone, felled by a heart attack when she was 16. What remained was her mother, anxious, weary, terrified of gossip, and an entire community council of self-appointed guardians of tradition. On this night, tradition dictated that Aaliya must accept her engagement to Imran Qureshi, a 37-year-old businessman recently divorced with 2 children. He was balding, loud, and carried an arrogance that seeped into every word he spoke. Wealth shielded him from judgment, while Aaliya's youth and quiet nature left her vulnerable. Her mother's eyes never met hers as the ring slid onto her finger. Aaliya's stomach tightened. She had protested weeks before, pleaded for more time, more choice, more respect, but her mother's voice had cracked like old wood. "You want me to be humiliated? What will people say if you refuse? Do you want me to carry my head in shame until I die?" So here she stood, shackled in the name of tradition, while her heart screamed into silence. The humiliation didn't end there. At the engagement party, Imran spoke with that oily smile, recounting jokes at her expense to the men gathered around him. "She's a pretty girl, but naive," he said, patting her head as if she were a child. "Don't worry, I'll teach her discipline. A wife must know her place." Laughter rippled. Aaliya sat in silence, gripping her palms until little half-moons of blood bloomed under her nails. She caught her reflection in the polished silver tray, her smile frozen, her eyes burning like a storm trapped behind glass. Something fractured inside Aaliya that night. It was not sudden, not a lightning strike, but a slow and certain break, the kind you could feel in your bones. The days that followed layered insult upon insult. Imran's phone calls became commands, not conversations. His mother called Aaliya too educated and urged her to give up her job at the library after marriage. Auntie Roxana spread rumors that Aaliya had been difficult since childhood and should be grateful anyone even agreed to marry her. And always, her mother's refrain, "Silence is survival. Tradition is protection. Endure humiliation so the family survives." But silence did not feel like survival anymore. It felt like burial. Every night, when the house was quiet, Aaliya would sit at her desk surrounded by books. She found herself gravitating toward stories of women who defied, Joan of Arc, Rosa Parks, Audre Lorde. Their voices reached across centuries, whispering to her, "You are not alone. You are not powerless." For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a different ending. The breaking point arrived 2 weeks before the nikah. Imran visited her home unannounced, swaggering as though he already owned the place. He pointed at the books on her shelf. "These?" He laughed. "Dust collectors. You won't need them when you're busy raising my children." Her mother tittered nervously, offering him tea. Then he leaned closer, his tone sharp enough to slice skin. "And stop talking back. I don't like stubborn women. You'll learn to obey. If not, I have ways. That night, Aaliya cried, not with helplessness, but with rage so sharp it tasted like iron in her throat. Obey. Belong. Endure. Words that once carried the weight of inevitability now ignited a fire in her chest. She pressed her hands against the mirror, staring at her reflection until her blurred face steadied into focus. No more, she whispered. No more. By dawn, her resolve had hardened. If they wanted her silence, she would give them thunder instead. If they wished to humiliate her in the name of tradition, she would turn that very tradition into their noose. Revenge was no longer a distant dream. It was a war cry, rising from every wound carved into her dignity. And though she stood alone, she felt the presence of all those silenced women before her, a river of voices crashing into a tide. Aaliya Khan would not bow. She would burn them with her truth. The game had only just begun. The morning after her vow of defiance, Aaliya went through the motions of daily life as if nothing had changed. She brewed her mother's tea, folded laundry, and walked to the library where she worked part-time. Outwardly, she was still the quiet daughter, the obedient bride-to-be. But inside her chest, something sharpened daily, a blade forged of humiliation, anger, and clarity. No one else noticed it yet. They laughed, they commanded, they ridiculed, just as before. Imran sent her lists of rules for married life. Auntie Roxana kept dropping in to remind her how fortunate she was. The community elders, a panel of elderly men who saw themselves as guardians of morality, kept whispering not-so-subtle warnings about family honor. They believed she was trapped. What none of them realized was that Aaliya had already decided to set fire to the very cage they thought indestructible. At the library, surrounded by shelves taller than her, Aaliya began her quiet research. Not on fairy tale romances or household guides, but on law. She read about domestic abuse cases, women who escaped forced marriages, and the intricate systems of shelters that operated underground. She pored over histories of immigrant struggles, case studies of women who broke chains and refused to serve silence. She discovered patterns, traditions used as masks for control, and systems of accountability waiting to be weaponized if only someone dared to use them. She took notes discreetly, filling an old notebook not with borrowed recipes or wedding plans, but with strategies. Options. Dangers. Exit routes. Yet her plan was not to run. Escape felt like defeat, and Aaliya wanted something far bolder, justice wrapped in vengeance. She wanted Imran and every elder who had laughed at her silence to choke on it when she turned it into thunder. The spark came unexpectedly, in the form of a young girl named Samira. She was 15, shy, and a frequent visitor to the library. One afternoon she trailed behind Aaliya, her arms full of novels. When they sat together, Samira hesitated before whispering, "My uncle says I'll be married soon. My mother says I should be happy. But I don't want to." Aaliya felt her breath catch. Another voice lost in the machinery of tradition. She leaned closer. "What do you want, Samira?" The girl's eyes welled with tears. "I want to finish school. I want to go to college." Aaliya clasped her hand gently. That small hand trembled with the same fear Aaliya had once carried, a fear that could be turned into fire. That night, she realized her revenge would not only be personal. It would be systemic. If they dared use tradition to bury girls like her, then she would use their own cracks to free the buried. She began building her network quietly. At first it was just Samira and a couple of other women she noticed whispering similar fears. Over cups of secretly shared coffee, hushed exchanges at mosque events, and long conversations disguised as tutoring sessions, Aaliya gathered a circle of silent rebels. Young girls resisting forced marriages. Widows tired of being treated as burdens. Even a few married women worn thin by humiliation. One by one, they came to her. Hesitant at first, then desperate for someone to listen. And Aaliya listened. She listened with burning patience, because every story became another matchstick in her arsenal. But resistance required more than stories. It required strategy. So she dug deeper into financial systems, into laws, into community politics. She discovered that Imran Qureshi's wealth wasn't as stable as his arrogance suggested. His businesses had debts buried in paperwork. His donations to the mosque had bought him influence, but also masked fraud. The council elders, who paraded as protectors of morality, had skeletons rattling behind their speeches. Some hid affairs. Others manipulated funds in the name of charity. They were not pillars of honor. They were men cloaked in rotting fabric. And Aaliya, for the first time, felt not powerless but predatory. Still, the biggest challenge was her own mother. Each night, her mother reminded her, patience. Obedience. Do not bring shame to us. And though those words stabbed Aaliya like poisoned arrows, she forced herself to stay calm. Her mother was not her enemy. Her mother was just another casualty of fear, another woman beaten small by tradition until obedience seemed the only survival. But Aaliya vowed that one day, soon, she would show her mother that survival need not mean submission. The council set a date for her nikah, 3 weeks away. 3 weeks. That was the timeline of her war. Aaliya began leaving trails deliberately. She let word slip that she was nervous about Imran. She let her supposed moments of weakness circulate, so people underestimated her even more. She smiled demurely, played the docile puppet, while in shadow she wove her rebellion tighter. When Imran visited again, laughing about how he would break her into obedience, she did something unexpected. She laughed too. Quietly. As if she were agreeing. But within that laughter, she buried her rage so deeply that it gleamed like a sharpened blade. On Sundays, the community gathered in the mosque hall for lectures. During one such gathering, Aaliya offered to help with organizing the women's seating section. It was here she planted her first real seed of public resistance, soft, careful, yet deliberate. A group of women argued about traditions, some defending obedience, others murmuring dissent. Aaliya chimed in lightly. "Isn't it strange," she said with just the right softness to seem innocent, "how tradition always seems to humiliate women, not men? Perhaps one day tradition will change." There was silence. Then some nervous laughter. Then disapproval from aunties. But she saw it, the flicker in younger women's eyes. The spark. It was dangerous, this small rebellion. But it was intoxicating too. That night, Aaliya returned home to find Imran waiting inside the living room with her mother. His jaw tightened as he pointed a finger at her. "Do not speak such things in public again," he warned. "You are my bride. My name will cover you. If you shame me, I will break you." Her mother shifted uncomfortably, pleading with her eyes for silence. Aaliya pressed her lips together. Then, ever so gently, she lowered her gaze and replied, "Of course." The submission was pretend. But Imran misread it as fear. She saw satisfaction curl on his lips. And she knew then, he had no idea the storm he was nurturing. The closer the wedding approached, the sharper Aaliya's resolve became. Her notebook grew thicker with names, dates, and connections. She had learned how to use the internet without leaving a trace, fake profiles, anonymous leaks, hidden documents. She was weaving a net invisible to the men who thought her powerless. Samira became her first ally in tech, clever with coding, brave despite her youth. Together they began collecting evidence, Imran's financial fraud. Elders' hidden wrongdoings. Every thread that could unravel the fabric of honor they wrapped themselves in. Aaliya's revenge was no longer just personal rebellion. It was becoming something larger, a reckoning. One evening, while standing on the porch under the blood-orange sunset of Chicago's autumn, Aaliya felt the wind brush against her scarf. For the first time in years, she allowed herself a small smile, not of submission, but of anticipation. She whispered into the twilight, "They think my silence means consent. Soon, they'll learn it means strategy." And with that, the seeds of rebellion flourished unseen, curling their roots through the foundations of the very tradition that sought to bury her. The wedding preparations consumed the household like a fever. Fabric swatches covered the furniture, trays of sweets cluttered the kitchen, and endless women's voices filled the rooms with gossip and expectations. Yet within that chaos, Aaliya moved with the stillness of a hunting cat. To everyone else she was the obedient bride, docile and quiet. But under her calm mask, a storm pressed against the edges of her skin. The seeds she had planted, her whispered conversations, her hidden notebook, the circle of young women gathering courage, had begun to grow. Now, all it needed was water. And water always came in the form of humiliation. Imran provided it in abundance. At what was supposed to be a simple pre-wedding dinner, he made another public spectacle of her. In front of 50 guests, Imran boomed, "My bride is shy, but I'll make a woman out of her. A strong hand makes an obedient wife." The men laughed, slapping his back. Aaliya's mother laughed too, brittle and forced. But Aaliya sat frozen, her fingers curling until her nails bit into her palm hard enough to hurt. Only one person saw it, the quiet, watchful Samira, who had joined the event with her family. From across the room, her young eyes burned in solidarity, and Aaliya knew she was no longer alone. That night, as she scrubbed dishes long after everyone left, her mother whispered sharply, "Couldn't you smile more? Why do you sit so stiff? You embarrass me in front of them." Aaliya turned, soap suds dripping from her hands. "Do you not see how he talks about me? Like I'm cattle he purchased?" Her mother's face crumpled. Better to be cattle than to be discarded. And in that single phrase, Aaliya understood her mother's prison more clearly than ever. She was so bent under the weight of honor that she believed humiliation was safer than freedom. But Aaliya was no longer willing to believe the same. The council elders, self-appointed guardians of morality, soon decided that Aaliya should stop working before her marriage. A wife must dedicate herself, they declared. Imran nodded smugly during the meeting, shooting her a look that said, "See, they are all on my side." That evening, when Aaliya arrived at work for what was supposed to be her last week, she lingered among the stacks of books longer than usual. There in the quiet, she made her first truly dangerous decision. Instead of resigning, she opened a hidden email account and began reaching out to advocacy groups she had read about. She didn't sign her name. She signed only with a phrase, "A woman who will no longer be silent." She leaked the first set of documents Samira had helped her collect, evidence of financial fraud by Imran. Not enough to destroy him, but enough to plant whispers. Enough to shake the image of untouchable power. And when she hit send, she felt her pulse steady, strong as a drum. Days later, the whispers began. At mosque gatherings, she overheard women murmuring, "Have you heard? Something about his business, unpaid debts." The men dismissed it, but Aaliya watched Imran's teeth grit tighter, his temper flash faster. Already cracks spread across his armor. But humiliation alone wasn't enough to break him. He had constructed his power upon the spine of tradition, and tradition itself had to be fractured. The second spark arrived at a women's committee meeting. Normally, such gatherings were harmless affairs, charity work mixed with gossip. But that day, an argument broke out among the younger and older women about whether girls should be allowed to attend university before marriage. The older women scoffed. Education spoils them. They think too much of themselves. Girls are meant for homes, not classrooms. Aaliya's heart pounded. She knew it was risky, but risk was all she had left. Rising to her feet, she spoke without permission. Tradition is not a prison, she said, her voice steady. If it demands humiliation of women, then it is not tradition. It is cruelty. The room fell silent, shocked. Auntie Roxana sputtered. Who are you to speak against our customs? Aaliya met her eyes coldly. Who are you to defend them while girls are suffering? Gasps erupted. Some older women scolded her immediately. But others, especially the younger girls, sat taller, their eyes wide and alight. It was a dangerous gamble. News would reach the council, and certainly Imran. And it did. That night, Imran stormed into her house uninvited, slamming the door behind him. Enough of your insolence, he growled, towering over her. You will not humiliate me with your speeches. His hand rose, threatening. For the first time, Aaliya did not flinch. She stared at him, her voice low and unshaken. Touch me, and I will make sure the world sees exactly what kind of man you are. He froze, hand hovering in the air. Something in her gaze unnerved him. Slowly, he lowered his arm. But his voice boiled. After the wedding, you'll have no choice. I'll control everything about you. When he left, slamming the door, her mother collapsed onto the sofa sobbing. Why do you provoke him? Do you want us both destroyed? Aaliya crouched by her mother, taking her hands gently. No, Ammi. I want us both freed. It was the first time she had spoken her rebellion aloud. It sounded terrifying. And yet, it sounded like truth. The very next day, the breaking point arrived. Aaliya attended a large community dinner where both families were present. Laughter, speeches, and the smell of lamb and saffron filled the rented banquet hall. Halfway through the evening, Imran, drunk with pride if not alcohol, stood up to make a toast. Let me assure you all, he declared in a voice dripping with arrogance, my bride will no longer be wasting her time with silly jobs or books. From the moment she steps into my house, she belongs only to me. He smirked, raising his glass. And if she ever forgets it, she'll learn quickly what happens to disobedient women. The hall exploded with laughter among men. But a silence fell over the women, some from discomfort, some from fear, and a few from quiet fury. Aaliya sat with her hands folded, her face utterly still. But inside, something long-caged finally shattered free. In that instant, she stopped worrying about fear, or shame, or hesitation. Imran had humiliated her not only as a bride, but as a woman, in front of her entire community. He had lit her fire in public. Now she would burn him in public. Later that night, when the hall emptied and guests dispersed, Aaliya walked outside into the cool Chicago night. Samira approached quietly, her small figure shadowed under the yellow streetlight. Are you okay? She whispered. Aaliya turned, meeting her eyes. And then, for the first time, her lips curved into a smile that was no longer forced. No, she said softly, her voice steady as cement. But they will be. And with that, part 2 of her life closed, the quiet gathering of seeds, the whispered rebellion. The storm had begun. The night of the banquet lingered in Aaliya's mind like smoke that refused to fade. Imran's words had pierced something in her, not because they were new, but because they had been spoken loudly, proudly, publicly. For years, humiliation had been smuggled into her life in whispers, behind closed doors, dressed as community values. But now? Now, the insult stood in the open, spotlighted before her entire world. Imran believed that arrogance was shield enough. Aaliya knew better. Humiliation was dangerous not because it destroyed, but because sometimes it created. The very next morning, as the community buzzed with talk of the banquet, Aaliya began putting her plan into motion. She stayed outwardly compliant, dressed in soft muted colors, head bowed. But privately, she became a shadow weaving threads across invisible gaps. Her first step was exposure. The whispered rumors of Imran's failing businesses hadn't yet gained traction. Men dismissed them, women feared to repeat them. So Aaliya decided to amplify them. With Samira's help, she created anonymous online accounts to post carefully curated threads, evidence of missing loan payments, court complaints, and fraudulent dealings hidden deep in public records. Screenshots circulated. A man who had boasted about his untouchable wealth suddenly found his name tied to whispers of debt and deceit. She didn't need the lies. The truth was scandal enough. The second step, undermining the elders. The council, a group of self-proclaimed guardians of honor, were the true architects of her cage. They sat on their dais, demanding obedience, rewarding silence, and branding resistance as disgrace. But their robes of authority were moth-eaten, and Aaliya had found the holes. One elder's charity fund was missing thousands of dollars. Another had been quietly arranging a secret second marriage without his wife's knowledge. A third son had been arrested for possession of drugs, swept under the rug with hefty bribes. Piece by piece, Aaliya and her circle of women gathered the evidence. They didn't release it all yet, vengeance required patience. But the women whispered in kitchens, in prayer halls, in school parking lots. They didn't shout, they murmured. And sometimes whispers spread faster than screams. One evening, Aaliya organized what looked like an innocent study group with her small circle of women allies, including Samira and a few restless wives desperate for air. They met in her living room over tea and biscuits, but instead of studying religion, they planned resistance. You don't need to fight every battle the same way, Aaliya told them, her eyes glinting. Sometimes you don't confront, sometimes you weaken, you outlast, you turn their own weapons against them. Samira's young voice trembled with excitement. Like, strategy in a video game? Aaliya chuckled. Exactly. Except this isn't fiction. It's our lives. Each woman in the group had a grievance, forced marriage, financial control, constant shaming, and Aaliya gave them tasks that seemed small, harmless even. One would pass certain documents accidentally to the wrong person. Another would ask innocent questions in public that hinted at corruption. Another would use social gatherings to challenge traditions ever so slightly. It wasn't a war fought with swords. It was death by 1,000 cuts. But her enemy wasn't asleep. Imran sensed her growing resistance, though dimly, interpreting it as mere stubbornness. His responses grew threatening, if still restrained by public image. After the wedding, he warned, gripping her wrist tightly when no one watched, "You'll learn obedience. You cannot win against me. I own the respect of this entire community." His smile reeked of certainty. And Aaliya, steady-eyed, realized something crucial that night. Imran did not fear her. But he feared ridicule. He feared exposure. He feared humiliation. That would become her weapon. The opportunity arrived sooner than she expected. At a Friday prayer gathering, the council made an announcement about protecting our daughters. Aaliya knew well what that meant, another sermon lashing out against young women who studied too much, spoke too loudly, behaved too Western. Elder Malik, their chairman, thundered from the microphone, "We cannot allow disobedience, shame, and rebellion to spread. Women must honor our ways, silence is dignity." The hall echoed with murmurs of agreement among men. But then, from the women's side, a young voice rang out. And what of men who break dignity with violence and lies? Gasps swept the hall. Every head turned. The voice belonged not to Aaliya, but to Samira. Malik flushed crimson, sputtering, "Sit down, child. You know nothing of our ways." Aaliya gently placed a hand on Samira's shoulder and rose beside her. She didn't shout. She only asked, her voice calm but carrying. "Tell us, Malik uncle, if silence is dignity, why does it only apply to women?" The hall froze. Every eye snapped to her, some horrified, some admiring, some hungry for scandal. Malik fumed, shouting something about insolence, but the crack had already split. Women whispered, emboldened. Men muttered nervously, unsettled. And Aaliya knew, revenge wasn't always destroying an enemy. Sometimes, it was simply showing the world his rot until people recoiled. The weeks leading to her wedding turned volatile. Imran tried to tighten control, even banning her from attending gatherings. But it was too late, the fire had been lit. Anonymous posts about his fraud spread, elders gossiped behind closed doors, the younger generation began questioning outright. His name, once pristine, now attracted rumors, doubt, unease. At home, her mother wavered between fear and bewilderment. "Why do you fight them? You will ruin us both." But then, one evening, when Aaliya showed her mother proof of Imran's debts and Malik's corruption, something shifted in the older woman's eyes. She whispered, almost to herself, "So it is not God's will we suffer shame, it is men's." For the first time, her mother's silence cracked. The revenge sharpened further at a family dinner when Imran mocked her reading habits again. Smiling sweetly, Aaliya excused herself briefly and returned with a stack of printed documents, his business debts, and placed them quietly on the table. "Since you dislike books," she said with softness hiding a blade, "perhaps you'll enjoy these numbers more." The room went silent. His mother stammered. His uncle coughed. Imran's face drained of color. She didn't need to say more. She only walked away, leaving the documents upon the table like a snake in the center of a feast. It was then she realized her revenge had already begun to succeed. Not because Imran was destroyed yet, but because she was no longer afraid. She didn't bow. She didn't smile to appease. She looked him in the eye as an equal, not his bride, not his property, not his victim. And for the first time, she saw it, the flicker of doubt behind his arrogance, the tiny fracture in his control. Her silence had been their comfort. Now her voice would be their collapse. The wedding was now less than 3 weeks away. Preparations continued, but the air was thin with tension. Some families whispered about canceling, afraid of scandal. Others encouraged Imran to control his woman. But Aaliya was no longer the woman they thought her to be. Each night she sharpened her strategy, tightening her web of leaks and whispers. She didn't want to escape the wedding anymore. She wanted it to happen, because her revenge needed a stage. And there was no stage larger than a wedding hall filled with every voice that once told her to stay silent. The wedding day dawned cold and gray, the Chicago sky weighted with clouds that seemed to press down on the entire neighborhood. Inside her house, chaos rippled. Women hurried with trays of sweets, tailors rushed with final stitches, and her mother moved like a ghost, smiling, but pale with worry. Aaliya dressed slowly, deliberately. The crimson bridal lehenga was heavy, each bead and stone pressing against her like chains. Yet beneath the suffocating silk and gold, she felt lighter than she had in years. This wasn't shackles. This was armor. Today wasn't about binding her life to Imran Qureshi. Today was about ending his reign, and the reign of every man who had ever laughed at her humiliation. Today was the performance she had been quietly preparing for all along. At the wedding hall, glittering chandeliers reflected against walls lined with guests. The men sat proudly in their suits, council elders perched in their seats of honor like judges, women clustered in colorful rows. Every eye was on the stage where bride and groom would soon sign their vow into permanence. Imran arrived exuding confidence. Gold cufflinks flashed at his wrists, and arrogance laced his every step. He shook hands, accepted blessings, even dared a few jokes about training his bride. Laughter followed him. When Aaliya entered, the hall hushed. She walked with grace, her head high, crimson scarf trailing behind her like fire. For the first time in months, she wasn't pretending obedience. There was strength in her stillness, and though many mistook it for shyness, a few caught something strange in her eyes, calm, unwavering, dangerous. Imran reached for her hand. She gave it, steady, though her pulse beat like war drums. The imam began reciting verses, the binding ceremony unfolding. But before the final approval of the nikah, Aaliya spoke. "Wait," she said, her voice clear as glass shattering. The hall froze. The imam blinked in confusion. Imran stiffened, fingers tightening on her wrist. "I cannot sign," Aaliya said. "Not before truth is spoken." Gasps rippled. The room murmured like wind through dry leaves. Imran hissed under his breath, "Not now. Sit silently." But Aaliya pulled her hand free. Rising to her feet, she faced the crowd. Her voice was neither trembling nor loud, it was steady, and that steadiness carried more power than any scream. "You ask me," she began, "to accept a marriage built on obedience, silence, and humiliation. You ask me to bind myself to a man who calls me property, who mocks me, who promises to break me if I speak." The imam stammered, "Sister." But she cut through him like a blade. "Is this what you call tradition? That women must endure shame so men may sit as kings?" Uneasy murmurs spread. Some women looked down. Others, especially the young, stared at her wide-eyed, hungry for her words. Imran jumped to his feet, face red with fury. "Enough of this nonsense. Sit down." Aaliya turned her head slowly toward him, her lips curling into a calm, almost pitying smile. "You want silence, Imran? Then hear the silence that will follow when your name is dragged through ruin." And then she moved. From beneath her silk shawl, she pulled out a small flash drive and handed it to Samira, who rushed with quick, calculated steps to the projector screen at the back. The lights dimmed. The guests whispered in confusion. And then, one by one, the documents she had compiled filled the screen. Business debts. Loan defaults. Fraudulent accounts. Court complaints buried under bribery. "Here," Aaliya said, her voice rising, "is the man you call honorable. A man who hides debt behind arrogance, who cheats families while pretending to be their savior." Gasps erupted. Elderly men shifted nervously. Women covered their mouths in shock. Some younger men muttered angrily, others unsettled by the sharp sting of exposure. Imran lunged forward, shouting, "Stop this at once." But Aaliya wasn't finished. She turned, her gaze falling upon the council elders. And what of them? Men who lecture women about morality while hiding corruption in their own homes. The next slides showed missing charity funds. Secret second marriage contracts. Bribes. Each document laid bare decades of sanctimonious filth. The hall broke into chaos, screams, denials, shouts of outrage. Malik, the council leader, stammered his innocence, sweat dripping down his temples. But the young voices rose louder. One girl cried out, "Why should we obey men who cannot even obey honesty?" Another woman stood. Yes. For years they demanded silence, but it was only to protect their own sins. Imran grabbed Aaliya's arm in desperation, his nails biting into her flesh. His voice cracked, barely a whisper, "You'll regret this." But she didn't flinch. She leaned close and whispered back, calm as steel, "No, Imran. You will." Because the final blow was still to come. With a nod to Samira, Aaliya revealed the last piece, a recorded audio clip. Imran's voice, dripping with derision. "She'll learn her place. If she disobeys, I'll break her. Women are property, that's what tradition is for." His own words, played before every guest, echoed through the hall like a dagger thrown into silence. The eruption was instantaneous. Shouts. Disbelief. Anger. Imran's family scrambled to hush the noise, but the words could not be unheard. The powerful businessman, self-proclaimed protector of tradition, exposed as a fraud and abuser in front of the very people he valued most, his community. The Nikah collapsed into chaos. The Imam declared it could not continue under shameful revelations. Families stormed out, whispers trailing like wildfire. Imran's rage boiled over, and he screamed at Aaliya in full public view, yet even his voice couldn't drown out the steady current of women rising, whispering, shouting, questioning. It was not just Aaliya's rebellion anymore. It was theirs. Auntie Roxana shouted for someone to silence her, but 3 younger women stepped forward, shielding Aaliya with their bodies. For the first time, women defended another openly against the tide of tradition. And in that moment, Aaliya knew her revenge had succeeded already, not only because Imran was ruined, not only because the elders' authority cracked, but because the silence itself had shattered. Later that night, back at home, Aaliya sat alone in her crimson bridal dress, discarded jewelry piled on the table. Her mother entered slowly, eyes wet with unshed tears. For the longest time, silence hung between them. Then her mother spoke, voice trembling. "I thought you would destroy us. But tonight, I saw our chains breaking. For the first time." She sank onto the chair beside her daughter, held her hand, and whispered, "Forgive me." Aaliya squeezed her hand softly. "There is nothing to forgive, Ammi. We were all taught to be silent. But silence ends with me." Her mother broke down into sobs, resting her head against Aaliya's shoulder. And for the first time in years, Aaliya held her not with shame, but with strength. News spread quickly in Chicago's community. Imran's name sank into disgrace overnight. His business partners withdrew. His family retreated into secrecy. His supporters dwindled into whispers. The council elders clawed at credibility but could never scrub away the photographs, the documents, the recordings that had gone viral. People didn't remember every detail, but they remembered enough. Tradition had been challenged, silence had been broken, and it was broken by Aaliya Khan, the bride who refused to bow. Her vengeance wasn't blood. It wasn't violence. It was exposure. It was humiliation returning to its rightful owners. And beneath its weight, the old order trembled. Chicago had not seen scandal like this in years. The fallout from Aaliya's wedding night thundered from community centers to grocery stores, from university halls to mosque corridors. Wherever South Asian families gathered, the story was whispered. The bride exposed the groom. She ruined the council. She humiliated men in front of everyone. She destroyed her own honor. Yet beneath the loud condemnations, something quieter, more dangerous grew, a current of questions. Women repeated her words when no one else listened: tradition is not a prison. If it humiliates women, it is cruelty. Daughters recited them in secret. Mothers mold them in silence. Even some men, especially younger ones, wondered whether the foundations they had built their pride upon were not rock but sand. For Imran, the collapse was rapid. Business associates pulled out of deals, refusing to be linked to scandal. Clients withdrew contracts. His reputation, once the heart of his wealth, was shredded. Several banks where he held debt refused to renegotiate, emboldened by the confirmation of his fraud. Where once he had strutted into mosques as the wealthy benefactor, he now avoided gatherings entirely, lest the murmurs suffocate him. He sought revenge, of course, threats whispered through family channels, demands for Aaliya's punishment. But his words held no teeth anymore. He had relied on image and authority as his weapons, and both had been publicly shattered. He was exposed, and exposure was exile. The council elders fared little better. Within weeks, their authority fractured. Younger community members refused to attend their lectures, questioning their right to moral leadership. Women, inspired by Aaliya, met to form their own discussion groups. Old donations dried up as families demanded accounting for years of mismanaged charity. For the first time in decades, the elders were on the defensive, scrambling to cover holes too wide to conceal. Malik, their leader, tried to preach fire against rebellious women, but his voice rang hollow against the knowledge of his own corruption. No one shouted directly at him yet, but the silence after his sermons was no longer obedience. It was rejection. Meanwhile, Aaliya navigated the maelstrom with quiet mastery. She returned to the library job she had been ordered to abandon, walking through its doors with calm dignity. Some stared, some whispered insults, but others stopped to smile, subtle and respectful. Young girls whispered her name like a legend. Mothers who had once scolded their daughters for defiance now asked in cautious tones if Aaliya offered tutoring or mentorship. She was no longer simply a woman who said no to humiliation. She was a living question mark lodged into the tradition itself. But she had no illusions, she was also a target. One night, walking home from the library under pale street lamps, she sensed footsteps behind her. Quick, heavy. She quickened her pace. Two men, strangers but with familiar accents, followed close. "You think you're brave?" one sneered. "You bring shame and now you want to walk freely?" Aaliya's chest tightened, but she did not run. She slipped her hand into her bag, gripping the small pepper spray she had carried for weeks, knowing this was inevitable. The men lunged. In one sharp motion, she turned, spraying the burning liquid directly into their eyes. They collapsed, screaming, clawing at their faces. Neighbors rushed out at the commotion. Within minutes, police sirens wailed. The attackers fled, but their faces were seen. Their intent spoken aloud. Aaliya stood beneath the swirling lights, her breath heavy, her hands steady. She was not defenseless. Never again. The incident only strengthened her legend. To some women, she was now untouchable proof that defiance was survival. To others, she was dangerous, reckless, even cursed. But what mattered most, she was unstoppable. The true climax arrived unwittingly at an annual community fundraiser months later. Traditionally, this event had been a glittering display of male power, businessmen flaunting checks, elders delivering pompous speeches, women relegated to cooking and serving. It was meant to reaffirm authority. But this year, the energy was different. Donations had dwindled, scandals lingered like smoke, and whispers spread that the fundraiser was Imran's last attempt to salvage influence. Aaliya was not invited. Of course she wasn't. She came anyway. Draped not in bridal crimson but in sharp ivory and black, she walked into the banquet hall with calm assurance. Heads turned instantly, shock, disapproval, curiosity. Imran was already at the microphone, attempting to rally, his voice strained. "We must remain united. We must not allow outsiders, or rebellious influences, to divide us." United in what? Aaliya's voice cut across the hall, clear as steel. The murmur surged. She strode forward, no hesitation, and took the microphone from his stunned hands. The room held its breath. No one divided this community, she said, her eyes sweeping the hall. You did. By demanding silence while men exploited it. By calling obedience holy while you yourselves thrived on deceit. Gasps. A few claps, quiet but real. You ask women for honor. Where is your honor? Hiding debts, stealing charity money, mocking brides as if they were cattle? Imran lunged for the microphone, but several women stood, not young rebels this time, but older mothers who had swallowed humiliation for decades. They blocked him with folded arms, their faces grim. The room tilted. Power tilted. You fear women's voices, Aaliya continued, because you know truth is louder than tradition. But tonight, let me make it clear, the silence is over. Permanently. And with that, Samira, sitting at the back, turned on a projector once again. This time, it wasn't fraud papers or audio recordings. It was testimonies, women sharing stories anonymously. Forced marriages. Physical punishments. Financial exploitation. Each recorded in soft voices, one after another, filling the hall with undeniable human pain. The elders squirmed. Imran shouted. But the crowd, angry, shaken, emboldened, did not leave. They listened. And once they heard, they could not unhear. The night ended not with the fundraiser's victory, but with its death. Families walked away not in obedience, but in shame for having allowed corruption under their noses. Donations evaporated. The council fractured. It was not only Imran who lost power that night. It was the entire chain of authority bent on using tradition as a shackle. Back home, Aaliya sat quietly on her porch, sipping tea as autumn leaves drifted down. Her mother joined her, silent for a while, then whispered. They will never forgive you. Aaliya smiled faintly. I don't need forgiveness. I need change. Her mother reached for her hand. This time, not pleading for silence, but holding it in solidarity. And above them, the night was vast. Endless. The climax was not thunder or fire. It was something sharper, slower, more permanent. Imran lost everything: business, name, respect. The elders were reduced to relics, their voices hollow in halls that once trembled at their words. And rising from the ashes of silence stood Aaliya, a bride who had refused humiliation, and in doing so, had changed more than her own fate. She had changed the air itself. Months had passed since the night of the fundraiser, but the ripples still moved outward like endless waves. Chicago's South Asian community had been irreversibly changed. Where once silence had been law, now people spoke, hesitantly at first, then with greater courage. And at the center of it all was Aaliya. She never asked to become a leader. She never wanted to be anyone's savior. Yet whether she liked it or not, her name had fused itself with resistance. Women approached her at the library, pretending to ask about books but whispering confessions instead. My husband controls every dollar. My daughter is being pressured into marriage. I want to leave, but I don't know where to go. At first, Aaliya listened quietly, overwhelmed by the flood. Then, she realized listening was not enough anymore. She had broken silence, now she had to build something in its place. With Samira's help, and the reluctant blessing of her weary but transforming mother, Aaliya began establishing a network for women. It started small, a single spare room in her house where a girl in danger could sleep for one night. Then another. Soon, she connected with organizations already fighting domestic abuse and forced marriages. They offered resources, funds, and legal guidance. The network grew into a shelter, a hidden, safe space where women could find refuge not only from violence but from suffocating traditions. She named it the Ashes House. When people asked why, she smiled knowingly, because from ashes, something stronger rises. The shelter became more than a refuge. It was a classroom. Women learned English if they didn't know it, studied basic financial independence, gained awareness of their rights, and, most importantly, found solidarity in each other. What had begun as her personal war transformed into a foundation of survival for others. The elders tried to recover, of course. Malik and others attempted to rebuild their authority with lectures about impurity, shame, and Western corruption. But their words no longer echoed the same. The community was split. Many still called Aaliya reckless, a curse, the woman who humiliated everyone. But many others, especially women, saw her differently. She was proof that speaking did not mean death. Proof that denial of obedience was possible. For every finger pointed in contempt, there was a whisper of admiration. Young girls who once expected to be silent brides now carried themselves differently. Mothers who once bowed their heads now allowed themselves questions. Even some fathers, though wary, confessed that their daughters deserved the education their wives never received. Tradition wasn't gone, but it had been forced to evolve. And Aaliya had become its necessary fracture. As for Imran Qureshi, his downfall was complete. His debts consumed his business. His family, once proud, withdrew from social life entirely. Rumors of his abuses added salt to his wounds, testimonies from women he had belittled, employees he had threatened, even ex-wife confessions long silenced. He tried legal threats against Aaliya, but the evidence she had unveiled was too strong. His credibility was already ash, no court, no counsel, no bank cared to side with him. Once, he had been the kind of man who silenced rooms with arrogance. Now, when he walked into public spaces, people muttered, sneered, or simply looked away. Isolation became his prison. And to Aaliya, that was the sharpest revenge of all, not that she had destroyed him, but that his own sins had done it when the light was allowed to shine. Perhaps the most complicated transformation was her mother. For weeks after the wedding scandal, she lived in fear of rejection by relatives, fear of gossip, fear of dishonor. But slowly, as she saw women coming to Aaliya for help, as she watched her daughter stand taller and stronger, something softened. Something cracked. One evening, while rolling dough in the kitchen, she looked at Aaliya with tired but gentle eyes. "I used to think survival meant silence," she confessed. "But I see now, survival was only half of it. Living is the other half, and you've given that to us all." Tears stung Aaliya's eyes. For years she had carried the weight of her mother's fear like a chain. Now, at last, it felt as though they carried each other as equals. It wasn't long before local news picked up the story, not the gossip version, but the movement. Aaliya was cautious, refusing personal fame, but she allowed journalists to cover the Ash's house. She gave interviews not about her own life, but about all the women who've been silenced too long. At universities, she was invited to speak. At women's rights conferences, her voice rang as proof of immigrant struggles hidden behind closed doors. Not everyone applauded, of course. Community backlash remained fierce in many circles. But the louder the condemnations, the more undeniable her impact became. She hadn't wanted it. But she became a symbol nonetheless. Through it all, Aaliya remained grounded. She still worked at the library, still read late into the night, still brewed tea for her mother every morning. But she had learned something vital: vengeance alone was not enough. Revenge set fire, justice rebuilt. And what mattered most wasn't simply that Imran and the elders had fallen, it was that the next generation would rise stronger from their ashes. Sometimes, when the house was quiet and her mother asleep, she sat by the window and thought of the girl she had been, the silent bride, the humiliated daughter, the obedient pawn of tradition. She no longer recognized that girl. Because the woman she was now had scars, but she also had wings. It was a spring afternoon when Samira arrived, taller now, her eyes glowing with ambition. She waved a college acceptance letter in her hand, the first in her family to make it that far. They said no at first, she grinned. But I didn't care. I said yes to myself. And they're letting me go. Aaliya hugged her, laughter bubbling in her chest. It was the sweetest kind of victory. Not headlines, not speeches, not scandals, but this. One girl, free to choose her own life. As Samira left to celebrate with her mother, Aaliya stepped outside to the garden. The trees rustled with newborn leaves. Her mother sat nearby, smiling softly, no longer burdened by the shadows of shame. Aaliya lifted her face to the sky, inhaling deeply, feeling the vast air stretch open around her. For years, she had breathed through cages of silence. Now she breathed through endless space. Tradition tried to break me, she whispered to herself. But I learned, tradition is just men's voices stitched together. It is not God. And I will never bow to it again. Her voice rang steady, carried by the wind, spreading out into her city, perhaps even beyond. Aaliya Khan's revenge had never been about cruelty. It had been about rebalancing what was broken, reclaiming what was stolen, and refusing humiliation in the name of tradition. In the ashes of silence, she had built survival. In the fire of vengeance, she had forged freedom. And in the life that followed, she had given birth not to ruin, but to a new kind of hope.